Good evening, folks. This is Eddie Carson, and you're listening to Race Matters here at WJOPLP Newburyport Joppa Radio 96.3. I'm glad that you're chiming in tonight as we're going to spend some time, again, delving into the funk, really exploring the nomenclature of race, of structures, and the systems that exist and the ways in which those systems exist, and what does that mean for us? So last show, I had this awesome lady on my show, and her name is, and you may recall this, Jennifer Rocco Runyon. And we really talked a lot about notions of race, particularly here locally in Newburyport. And of course, in doing so, I got to thinking, what does it mean to have white privilege? What does it mean to really examine this notion of privilege, but particularly in terms or in the ways that in which that kind of make people nervous? A word that comes up a good little bit, and for you folks who don't know this term, this is one that you need to know, and it is called white fragility. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of white fragility before. Anyone? Yep, I'm going to raise my hand here too. But that word white fragility took prominence, particularly over the last, I'd say few years, particularly with the publication of a book by this white sister by the name of Robin DiAngelo. And Robin DiAngelo, she's a sociologist who spends a lot of time doing diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops, seminars. She publishes scholarly articles, and she spent a good bit of time really exploring not only her own sense of white fragility, her own sense and her own notions of privilege that are there too, but she also spent quite a bit of time really helping other folks understand their positionality and where they are when it comes to elements of it. So if you don't know Robin DiAngelo, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go out and you're going to buy her book. Her book is titled White Fragility. And one of the things that she attempts to do, of course, is she looks to explain notions of what does white fragility mean? What does it mean to, one, be a white person who is defensive, somewhat agitated, resistant to the realities that force people to have to really recognize, right, the ways in which they integrate or segregate or explore notions of racial identity with other people. One of the things about Robin DiAngelo that she does, of course, is that she argues in her book, this fantastic book, that she argues that, that our society, for the most part, is largely segregated. And when we talk about how it's largely segregated, she talks about how white folks tend to create an insular sense about themselves, primarily because it's rused and predicated on racial discomfort, so that, right, that racial discomfort in ways in which when elements of race come up, there's this triggering mechanism that oftentimes white people feel, and they don't know how to really relate nor examine nor think about the emotion and that feeling that's there. And you know what, folks? Particularly white folks, and that's who I'm talking to right now, if those things are a part of you, that's okay. And folks are like, well, brother, what do you mean that's okay? I say it's okay because, see, the first thing that people have to recognize is they have these feelings, these emotions, these experiences when they come into contact with racial discomfort when they are when they're addressing matters of racial topics. And so I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing, right, is once white people recognize the fact that there's a semblance of racial discomfort, really exploring the ways in which they can address and they can examine that racial discomfort. A lot of basic things. And one of the things that people tend to do oftentimes is they read a book, right? They read a book. And I think that's the heart and the soul of things that need to happen. They go out and they find the right books to read in ways that'll expand their vocabulary, their language, their understanding of the language and the realities that exist there too. I think the second thing, of course, that happens once there's a little bit of educational element is really to think about this sense of self-examination. And one of the things that I've always asked white people to do, whether it's friends, whether it's colleagues, whether it's soul folks, it doesn't matter, is just to sit down with a sheet of paper and then start mapping out the ways in which you have contact with other people of color, particularly BIPOC. Black, indigenous people of color, and that contact can be taken in different ways. Contact could be seen in things such as, do you have any type of intimate knowledge or relationship or connection with a person of color, right? And maybe you're someone who lives in a community that is so insular, because we do, unfortunately, here in the 21st century, live in a segregated world, in a segregated society. Just look around your neighborhood, for example, and think about that. Do I live in an isolated, in an insular, in a segregated community? And there are a lot of reasons and a lot of ways that comes into place. If you have children or grandchildren, or you're a guardian, or you are around young folks, you're a role model and you're someone that they look to. What are the type of books that they're seeing in your house, in your library? What are the magazines that are there? What kind of shows are you watching in which the people on screen are not all white? Do you see that in any way? What kind of music are you listening to? And I'm talking about music that really showcases the image, the narrative, the functionality of people of color, right? That's the thing that I'm wondering if people will examine and they'll think about too, right? What kind of magazines that you have laying around? What kind of food? What kind of restaurants are you supporting? Are you going to? Young folks need to see you model those things. And by seeing those things that are there, even if you say, well, Brother Carson, you know those things don't exist in my community. Boston is just down the road. And I can name a number of restaurants down there just off the top of my head. I'm embarrassed, I'll admit. And I'm going to give this restaurant a shout out next week because somehow, I don't know how this happened. It's like reading a great book and you forget the title of the book. And that's happened to me a few times. This past Sunday, I was in Rockport. Don't know if you've ever been to Rockport, Massachusetts, but I mean, it's super white. And there is a BIPOC couple that started this Caribbean, Cajun, soulful restaurant, Black owned, BIPOC owned. And the food was just super awesome. Are you supporting those venues the way you need to support those venues? Those are ways in which you can really kind of start to realize and examine your own sense of white fragility, that intimacy, that connection. And that place, that food was super good. I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna give them a shout out next week. And I may have to do a show where I'm just really kind of giving an education on all these places that people need to visit and everything too. But those are the things that create cracks in white fragility. Why don't you holler at Brother Carson? I'll take you out to dinner. Or you can take me out to dinner, or we can go Dutch, right? I like dates, all right? I'm all about dates. You gonna take me out on a date? You gonna take me out on a date? Yeah? Oh, I got these white sisters here who said they're gonna take me out on a date right there. I'm all about that, okay? And so you get a chance and you'll spend some time and you'll hang out with me in the ways that need to. You can ask me any question you want. I'm pretty open. I like to help us examine and think about things, not only about my own identity, but to help you think about your own racial identity in ways that are there too. You know, so we go back to this book, White Fragility. And in it, Robin DiAngelo, who is, by the way, white, right? Don't let her last name D'Angelo fool you or anything like that. She emphasizes that there's this positionality, there's this stance that really creates this this infrastructure of white folks that creates this wall. Oh, I love it. That's funny because I meant to bring my own copy here, but this great sister Sarah Blackstone just came by and gave me an awesome copy of the cover and everything too. And is this the one with Michael Eric Dyson's intro? It is, or forward. I'm just going to show you this right now for those who are watching the YouTube station. Those of you who are on the radio listening and everything, well, you can hear me talk about it. White fragility is just super wonderful. And it's great, too, in a sense that what it does, of course, is that it really allows us to think about the work that needs to be done, especially among white liberals. And white liberals tend to be one of the most defensive populations, the defensive groups when it comes to this. White folks who are New England white liberals particularly, but white liberals in general across the country, get defensive if there's even an echo that they're behaving in ways that could be perceived or seen as racist behavior, right? I mean, we got to remember when we talk about anti-racist work, you're either doing the work of promoting anti-racism and the struggle against racism because everything you do in your life and your soul is for that, or even if you're not aware that you're engaged in both are either implicit or even explicit behaviors, right? Explicitly, I'm sure you know about that, but even in implicit ways, contributing to racist behavior, white supremacist attitudes that exist there too. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that white fragility holds racism in place. And I think that's the key thing. And so if we're looking and we're thinking about this, what I would call this defense mechanism that really makes up white fragility. And when people see things, right? Let's talk about a couple of examples that kind of dominates the narrative of white fragility. I cannot believe Disney is, and again, I'm probably completely wrong. I can't remember the last time I watched something on TV or whatever, but I should know this. I can't believe Disney is casting a black Cinderella. Right? And people get all upset because we all know Cinderella is white. And how dare they portray this? This is nothing but liberalism at best. Right? People really trying to engage and invade spaces that they don't belong. How dare them? Or they're upset because some makeup company is starting to become a little bit more aware that, you know what? We need makeup that's going to match the skin tone and the color of different folks. Other people besides white folks wear makeup, but when we're upset about that. And I use these examples because these are the things, folks, that I have heard come out of folks' mouth. In front of me, in conversations, or in ways in which they were unaware that I was listening to what they were saying. Someone being upset about Band-Aids. All right, what's the big deal? People making a fuss that Band-Aid should match the skin tone, your skin tone, right? Those are extreme examples, but those are the examples that are there, and I think those are the things that we want to keep in mind too. You know, when we think about white fragility, I want to give you this quote here from Robin DiAngelo, right? She notes that to the degree that white progressives, white liberals, right, to the degree that white progressives think we have arrived, we will put our energy into making sure that others see us as having arrived. While we all know we have not arrived, let's just focus on all the things we're going to do to really sell this notion that we have finally gotten to the promised land. That's what Brother King was talking about. But yet, in fact, that's racist thinking. And it ignores the struggles that exist for so many people for such a long period of time. You know, in Robin DiAngelo's book, there's a section, and I don't know, I may not be able to pull that section out too quickly or anything, but I think I have it, memorized off the top of my head. She delves in and she talks about the argument of civil discourse and conversations. And one of the things that we know is anytime you hear people have conversations, particularly because we're in a political season right now, we're still waiting for the final results of both the House and the Senate races, that people need to engage in conversations that are civil conversations. When you hear the word civil, that means you need to behave. And yet, when we talk about civil behavior, we're talking about people who have, for a long period of time, have been marginalized. They have been set in corners, and yet they're raising their voices, whether it's through their books, their publications, protests, in their own local schools, maybe even in the workplace, to bring some semblance of awareness to the problems that do exist and the problems that we need to examine. That is it. You know, much of white fragility is dedicated to pulling back with W.E.B. Du Bois, and you've heard me talk about that brother, one too many times. That veil. And once that veil is pulled back, there's this resurrection, this sense of consciousness in which people start to see this light. In many ways, it's kind of like the cave allegory. Didn't realize the world that you lived in until you saw the light. And then once you've seen a light, you become fully aware that there are problems that exist. And we need to delve into those problems. Part of the veil, of course, are the so-called pillars of whiteness. And when we think about these pillars of whiteness, right, we have to start thinking about things such as the assumptions that are made that really propagate racist beliefs without realizing that you're engaged in propagating racist beliefs. The assumption, of course, about people of color, tendencies towards violence, or their academic and educational acumen, and whatever that may look like. Their behavior and what is seen as civil and normal behavior and what is not. You know, when we talk about white fragility is ideological. And Robin does talk about that. She talks about the ways in which such ideological framings include things like, throughout her book, individualism. And that individualism that really drives the behavior of racism. But yet we know institutional racism is really driven by structural systems, structural racist systems that are there. And of course, oftentimes we hear people come to the defense when we talk about white fragility of saying that those systems are not as bad as people make them out to be. One of my favorite examples, of course, is I had this colleague years ago, and I was sharing with her. It was the introduction of Cornel West's book, Race Matters, and I've talked about that work a few times on the show. Cornel West is in my doghouse right now, so it may be a while before I want to spend any time talking about him. But Cornel talks about when he was going to get the cover of him made for a picture of him made for the cover of the book Race Matters, and how cabs kept driving by him all the time. And in the process of these cabs driving by him, he couldn't hail a cab. It made him late for the photo shoot for his own book cover. So I'm having this conversation with this white colleague of mine back when I was living in Texas. And I have to confess, folks, this happened probably back in 2000 and, I don't know, maybe 2007, right? Pre-Obama. Wouldn't matter. But I didn't have the vocabulary nor the language to point this out to her. She was engaged in the behavior of white fragility, right? I pointed out how she's behaving and acting in macro-aggressive ways, but yet I didn't use this notion of white fragility because she would go on and say, well, I have this sister, her sister, who also lived in Manhattan, and her sister was this blonde, blue-eyed, really sophisticated Manhattanite, and she couldn't get cabs to pull over for her. Well, I'm just going to tell you this right now. Interesting statistic that I learned. You'll like this stat here. Only 2% of the population in the United States are blondes, but everyone wants to be a blonde because blondness really shapes the idealness of being white. Everyone wants to be blonde. Only 2% of the folks are blonde. The rest of folks are spending a lot of money making their hair blonde. The second thing, of course, is the fact that I'm pretty sure if a cab driver thinks that you have money, they're going to pull over, particularly if you're a white, blonde female. The sense of not being or posing a danger in someone who's not going to run out of the cab. But yet, and vice versa, right? That means that if you are a black person trying to hail a cab, no matter if you have a bow tie on, you're wearing a sport jacket or whatever may be the case, there's a sense that you're not going to pay. We can talk about examples that I've shared when it comes to white fragility, where I go to a restaurant and I like to dine well. That's just what I do. I like nice wine. I like to have a cigar and some scotch, maybe that evening after that nice wine. It's part of my bourgeois traits for a working class radical brother, but that's part of me. And so I've seen people put me in the back of rooms. I've seen, and I've actually observed and watched wait servers debate whether or not they wanted the seat and have my table, under the assumption that I'm not going to tip them well. Now, my problem is I overtip. So I'm just going to throw that out there too. But yet when I share these stories with folks, that sense of white fragility comes about, and there's the sense that, well, Eddie, you're making too much of a fuss out of this, right? You're making a big deal. Much like when you get pulled over, you're making too big of a deal out of this. And yet that defensiveness only perpetuates white fragility, which we've already stated stems from notions of racist behavior. So I always remind folks when I want to share a narrative with them that I want you to stop and I want you to listen, that I want you to engage in a conversation before that defense mechanism comes up. You know, when we think about what Robin DiAngelo talks about here, you know, one of the things that a reviewer stated, and I just want to share this, was that in White Fragility, DiAngelo sometimes adopts soothing, conciliatory tone toward white readers, as if she were appeasing a child on the verge of a tantrum. I want to give you this part, and I want to quote. If your definition of a racist is someone who holds conscious dislike of people because of race, then I agree that it is offensive for me to suggest that you are racist when I don't know you. It's what Robin DiAngelo notes in her book. I also agree that if this is your definition of racism and you are against racism, then you are not racist. Now, just breathe for a second and think about that for that examination, because one of the popular token phrases always is the fact that cannot believe, you know, just because I call someone the N-word, people think I'm a racist. Or just because I deny your reality because of your skin tone, or that I think structural racism is a myth and you're making this stuff up, or I think black people are lazy and they should just work a little harder. I think all of that stuff is just a myth. And those are some of the more extreme examples here too. I think in my world, and what I tend to encounter a great deal of time, I think what breaks my heart is what I'm going to say, more than anything else, when it comes to issues of white fragility, beyond the recognition and awareness that sometimes white folks don't realize that they're practicing and operating within a white fragile lens, is the fact that I can experience something in front of white people and they can be witness to it, and they won't check in on me, and they won't ask how am I doing. Sometimes they don't even come to my rescue. They'll just be stunned, watch, or even worse, it will go completely over their head and they will miss exactly what happened. No checking in, because that is not their problem. They don't have to worry about it. Now, I do want to give a shout out real quick to white folks who do come to my defense, because let me tell you, I got some amazing white friends. I got some folks who are always checking in on me just to say, hey, brother, you know, I know this incident or this situation is happening, and how are you doing? Can I swing by? You know what I love more than anything? I love when someone comes up and just gives me a hug. They just give me a hug and they look at me, don't even have to say anything, just nod their head, and know, or I know that they're walking side by side with me. And I think that is paramount for the recognition of white folks to pause their white fragility and to understand that they are navigating in spaces that have been constructed and built for them. And so when people of color, when BIPOC folks share their narratives, sometimes some folks get it, particularly those allies and those co-conspirators. Others go quickly on the defensive and don't know how to react to that. Have that conversation, right? Have that conversation. Have that conversation if you have a friend or of color, particularly a BIPOC friend. But don't just start the conversation off, especially if you don't know them. Like, hey, tell me about the microaggressions. Tell me about the experiences that you've encountered. What does that look like? No, don't do that. Don't do that. Let's just start off with a relationship. Get to know folks, and then really look to experience the things they go through. I always tell folks, and one of my favorite things, particularly for white folks, is you should go out to dinner with me. Go out to dinner with me. Don't care if you're a white woman. I don't care if you're a white woman with red hair. I don't care if you are a non-binary person, a white non-binary person. Don't care if you're a white man, right? Go out to dinner with me and just watch how people behave around me, the way they stare and the way they look. And I've mentioned this before sometime. They're like, oh, I think that's Eddie Carson. Yeah, you're right. I'll take that. Sometimes they think I'm someone else because they get me confused with other people. Never seen a black man before. This is shocking. Oftentimes, right, and one of the strangest things is where I'm having dinner or I'm out and someone will come up to my table and they will just disrupt my dinner and my conversation and just start going into questions and asking me things and making a whole narrative about them. Robbing my moment, robbing whoever I'm with of that moment that we're congregating in the ways that we're engaged with too. So those are things that are there. I'm not trying to make light of white fragility because it is a serious thing. And I think really the best thing that white people can do is really make sure you understand that white fragility is a defense mechanism that you're feeling when people tell you that A, you're behaving in a way that's detrimental and damaging to a person of color or a BIPOC person. It's one of those things where where people don't believe those things still exist here in the 21st century, mainly because they want to see the world as being this colorblind world, and that it's people like me that keep bringing up elements of race and pointing out that we are different. And so that's why those things exist. We don't live in a colorblind world, folks. Trust me. I see it every day. And when you walk into the room, trust me, I'm going to notice that you're white. I may notice a lot of things about you. You definitely will notice that I'm black when I walk into a room. You will not miss me. That is not possible. And guess what? That is okay. That is okay. I want you to see that I am black. I want you to see that I got nappy, woolly, black hair. Because, boy, that's part of my funk and my soul, and that's what I like. I have a little ego, a lot of confidence that comes along with a lot of things that defines who I am. That's okay, too. But more than anything else, right, I want you to see me for who I am. I want you to see my own insecurities because I am human, and I've yet to meet a human being that does not have insecurities that exist. As we get closer to the end of this, here at Race Matters, as you are listening to WJOP-LP Newburyport 96.3 FM, I want to share this with you here, dealing with Robin's book. One reviewer stated, and I thought this was great, I quote, "Self-righteousness becomes a seductive compliment to white fragility, as gin is to a mystery novel." I'm not a big gin drinker, and I don't read a lot of mystery novels, so I'm kind of intrigued by that example. Yet the point of the book, White Fragility, is that each white person believes herself the exception, right? Think about that for a second. That person is the exception. That's somebody else you're talking about. You're not talking about me. There's no way in the world you're talking about me. That is not even possible. The exception. One of very few souls magically exempt from a lifetime of racial conditioning and behavior, right? Somehow you just escaped all of that as you've lived predominantly in a white enclave in a country that has operated in highly segregated spaces. You've missed all of that stuff. But yet, my favorite thing that I hear when it comes to white fragility is that, I mean, I'm not racist. I understand what it's like to be black because I have a black boyfriend or husband or black wife or girlfriend, or my best friend just happens to be black, or I got a family member who's black. So I know all the conditions that are there. And so you're telling me things that I've never heard from other folks. Interesting. On one episode I think it was titled The Politics of DEI, on the YouTube station, a person commented, right? There are two black people who made this comment. So I want to be clear and transparent on that, well, structural racism must have forgotten about me, is what one person stated, because I don't experience any of these things. And the other person made some comment that, you know, essentially race is this invisible thing that people like me tend to tokenize. And that's not the case, right? The effort, the objective, and the job of this show is to educate people, give you something to think about. And if you don't agree with everything I say, which is, you know what, that's okay. At least you're listening, you're pondering, and you're thinking. You're going to take one thing, maybe even if it's only one line or one aspect, and you're going to ponder that for a little bit as you continue to improve yourself, as I am trying to improve myself daily. Now, I'm not pointing fingers at folks and not pointing them back at me, because I'm fully aware of my areas where I need to grow there too. So those are the things to keep in mind. Last thing I want to say about Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, is that the book is most diagnostic than solutions. It's not going to tell you. You're not going to read this book and say, whoa, here we go. A super white person right now, right? I got that SW super white. I'm much better and I'm really improved. No, what it's going to do, it's going to make you aware of the things you need to improve upon. And then that's the work, or the further work, that you have to do. It goes on and talks about the fact that this is not a solution-oriented work, and that the guidelines it offers towards the end, listen, think about it, right? Some guidelines. Disrupting white fragility. Listen. Don't center yourself. Get educated. Think about your responses and what role they play. That way, it won't shock any nervous systems that you are thinking about. The value in white fragility lies in its methodology and its irrefutable exposure of racism in both thought and action, and its call for humility and vigilance and a sense of being humble. That is what white fragility is all about. For folks who are going to jump all over me and say, well, this white fragility stuff is hokey, there's no such thing. That is example right there of white fragility, if your mind goes there. Hey, people, thanks for chiming in again with me for another episode of Race Matters as we discuss white fragility today. You're listening to Race Matters on WJOP LP Newburyport 96.3. If you have any questions, look down if you're on a YouTube station, kind of look down the thread. They do a really great job offering a nice description, and there is an email address there in which you can reach out to me and say, hey, brother, you gave me something to think about. Love to have a conversation. Better yet, I'd love to have a conversation with you on the show. Would you be open to that? All right, folks, be well. Thanks for joining in. I will see you next week.